Hi, everyone. Welcome to Season 2 of Make Business Better. I'm Zach Seward, the co-founder and CEO of Quartz. And this is our bi-weekly show live on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, where you're tuning in and seeing us right now, where we talk every other week to a new executive. We bring on to discuss their own challenges, how they're trying to make business better in their own corner of the business world, and with tips that we can all apply to our own work and lives. In season 1, we had this great lineup, 25 different guests talking about a whole variety of different challenges, from inclusion in the product process, to building, truly anti-racist companies, to addressing companies' environmental impacts and making pricing strategies more fair and guarding against gender inequity, among other topics. You can check out all of those episodes on our website, qz.com. And as we turn to season 2 and kick it off today, we've got a great slate of guests for the whole season. And what I'm hoping to do is get a little bit more personal. I think for all of us, the last 2 years have been a real mix of personal and professional challenges, sometimes at the, one and the same, sometimes hard to tell the difference. And I'd love to hear from my guests how they've experienced those challenges and how they've gotten over it and gotten help their teams through all the challenges of the last 2 years. So kicking off our season premiere of Make Business Better is a fantastic guest to speak to all of that, Leah Belsky. She's the Chief Enterprise Officer at Coursera. And we'll bring on Leah right now. Leah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Zach. Great to meet everyone.
So I should make sure we clarify. Chief Enterprise Officer, you're in charge of the enterprise business at Coursera, selling directly to companies?
Absolutely. The enterprise and business actually includes 3 segments. We partner with companies, governments, and then also universities around the world.
Got it. And what's it like having a CEO as your title? Is there anyone else? Is there a Chief Education Officer or other?
We don't use the abbreviation CEO, but I would say there's definitely a lot of jokes about it, and we have a real CEO of the overall company. And so when he first promoted me, you can imagine there were a lot of jokes.
Fair enough.
Well, and I hear that there's a lot of people in LinkedIn who read it and don't realize what they're reading. So it's an interesting experience.
From what I hear, you carry a lot of weight at the company, that so it may not be an inappropriate label anyway. But I do want to dive into the enterprise part of Coursera's business, and like I said in the intro, we're trying to get a little more personal in this season, and so don't mind. I would love to start by going back to March 2020, if that's not too harrowing a thought. And well, first of all, what for, I think we all have this, the moment it clicked, oh, this is a crisis, whether personally or professionally. What was it for you? Where were you? When did it dawn on you, oh, this pandemic is a real thing?
Yeah, so it's actually a very specific moment. So I was actually flying to Utah for an annual summit. It's called Learn and Ski, and they bring together founders and executives and entrepreneurs from education companies to a mountaintop in Utah. And as I was headed there on my own, my colleagues had started texting me saying in San Francisco, saying we are loading up on supplies at home. And that's when they started sending around these pictures of the empty grocery stores and the luggage. And so I'm driving up this mountain. I'm like, oh my God, I've left my family. San Francisco is about to go into quarantine. We don't have food. What do I do? And I remember stopping at the grocery store in Utah with my suitcase and filling up on canned goods because no one knew, and driving up to this summit. I'm happy to tell you more what happened on the summit. But that was the moment I personally realized, wow, this is real, and this is going to change things.
Ooh, I assume there was also a stay or go decision you had to make.
It wasn't a hop back on the plane situation, but it was I better start taking this seriously and preparing. And once my colleagues started texting me, you never know if it's just the people who are always preparing for disaster who are doing things. But once my colleagues started texting me, I'm like, oh, this is this is real. I should be preparing too. So, but I decided to stay, and I stopped at the grocery store and filled my suitcase with canned goods and pasta and all these things we don't usually eat, and continued on to the conference.
You don't ever fantasize about staying on top of that mountain for the entirety of the pandemic and then just coming back 2 years later?
Mountaintop is a place where many people actually disappeared to during the pandemic to escape, but not me.
I your story, well, obviously specific to you, I think is a pretty common one for all of us, in that it was first a personal recognition and sort of flailing for what is it we need to do to prepare on a personal level for us and our family. Let's turn to the point at which it dawns on you that this is also a professional, I was going to say crisis, but I think in your case, professional opportunity too. What were those early days like? Coursera, for those viewing not familiar, online education company. All of a sudden, every university, public school, and otherwise in the world is going online if they aren't already. I assume some are calling you up. What was that moment like?
So at that moment, that's when schools were starting to shut down. So you might remember that first they started shutting in China, and then it started spreading. I forget where next, but the schools started shutting down. The universities started shutting down. And we had actually gotten a call from one partner, a guy named Matt Raskoff over at Duke, who said, our China's campus is shutting down. And so I remember going up to this mountaintop, and again, I'm sitting with all these education entrepreneurs who are talking about the future of the education and how education is transformed. And you need to realize going into this that education is a sector that's usually behind. So the percentage of digital investment in education has historically been a fraction of what it is in other industries. It changes at a snail's pace. But when I got there, I sat down with my CEO, who was also at the conference, and we sort of just looked at each other and we're like, this is, the world now needs what Coursera has. Institutions all around the world are shutting down, and we have something that can keep the lights on and keep people learning. So it was at that moment we actually got into a little conference room, and we called the chief product officer and a couple of the members of the executive team and said, it seems like we should actually just open up Coursera and make it free for everyone. And so we had a product that we had launched 6 months earlier called Coursera for Campus. And what Coursera for Campus is it packages up our entire catalog of courses and allows any campus to integrate Coursera into their campus, either as standalone courses. So you may want to have courses in Python or data science or AI, and you might not have professors to teach it. Or it could be operating as like a digital bookstore and allow professors to incorporate the online lectures. And so we got together and decided, yes, we're going to make Coursera free. And I remember that moment because it was a big decision. We had presented to our board a couple of weeks earlier, telling them about the revenues we were going to make. We had a massive sales kickoff and flown all of our folks in, telling them what they needed to sell. And so, you realize I'm about to wipe all my revenues for this business line. I have no idea what will happen. And then technologically, we had no idea how much traffic we would get and whether there would be demand. And so technologically, the way we used to work is a campus, we'd sell to the campus, they would sign a contract, we would take a couple of days, pass to an implementation manager, they would have a kickoff. That was our process. And so the question was, how could we retool our system in 2 weeks so that anyone could come, hit the system, sign up, and deploy without manual intervention?
I want to hear about those 2 weeks in a second, but let's dwell on the decision as well, because I can only imagine how difficult that would be to make on the fly. And it is so many decisions that companies have had to make during the pandemic are lacking the data that we're used to make an informed business decision, mostly because this literally it hadn't happened in a century. But what are you weighing there? I mean, it's like in retrospect, it seems obvious. Other companies like Zoom did similar things where just open up the floodgates, and because this is a big moment for our kind of software. So in retrospect, it totally makes sense. But at the moment, like you said, you're putting a lot of revenue at risk. Yeah. How do you even go about is there a pro-con list? What's it look like?
So look, there's a couple factors. Like one, Coursera is a mission-oriented company, so we want to change people's lives through learning. And so there was this strong feeling of like, wow, this is our opportunity to serve. So that was a strong part of it. And then there was a sense, look, the goal of Coursera is to be a scaled platform with as much reach as possible. And so this seemed like a big opportunity to just spread our product around the world in a time of need. There were 1.8 billion students who were home at that point. And then, I was worried about the revenue opportunity. I was worried about what was the team going to say. I had hundreds of, sales and other go-to-market professionals who were relying on this business, what we were going to say. But, because there's that core mission orientation, I think people were excited to mobilize. And so, it's funny. I flew home actually on a plane with this woman named Betsy Corcoran, who's the editor-in-chief of a publication named EdSurge. And I was like, Betsy, I think we're about to make a big announcement. You can't tell. I shouldn't be talking to you as a journalist. And I asked her, and she said, you know what, these are the moments where you can actually drive impact, but also change the trajectory of a company. And I think you should go for it, even if it means that, you could take a big dip. And look, yeah, in retrospect, it seems obvious, but it was months before a lot of others in the sector put together response programs. And I wouldn't underestimate the technical challenge. So we ended up putting together a skunk team of a bunch of people in the company and saying, how do we automate this? And how do you prevent fraud? And how do you validate? And we had this skunk team work like crazy before we did a big launch. And it far exceeded what we thought in terms of reach. We had over 4,000 institutions. I think it was something like 70% of all universities in the world were suddenly on Coursera. And the rest, I'm happy to tell you more.
Wow. Yeah, no, we should definitely hear more about that. So clearly the servers held up after.
That was an issue. So Coursera traffic as well increased 500%. So the servers were an issue both on the consumer side and then the basic scalability on the enterprise side. So we were working with Amazon and we were worrying about, it was mania. But that's the time that actually I most remember that I feel so good about, people, the way our folks worked, the way we worked as a team in that moment, it was just like people had a reason for being and a passion. And it was that moment when everyone was at home as well. So most people had kids running around and didn't know up from down. And then you had people suddenly working 20-hour days to pull this off. And, those are the moments that are so memorable and special in a career.
Plus, we were all still assuming, this will be a month or two and back to normal. So.
Exactly.
I want to hear a little bit more about how you talk to the team, because I think a lot of rising to the occasion in a crisis often misses that it's not just about the leader getting themselves to the into the headspace and making the right decisions, but also bringing the team along with you. It sounds like you leaned heavily on the company's mission and talking about it.
Well, so there were a couple decisions to make. So we had made the decision, and then there was a couple other decisions to make. So were we going to suddenly reforecast our revenues? We were going to tell the team that they no longer had sales goals. Were we going to change the commission plans? And so, one key decision was, were we going to both announce this and also change the overall business plan or not? And so we sort of gave a double whammy, decided to make everything free and tell the team, we don't know if this will be upside or downside, so we're not going to stop selling and we're not going to change your goals. And it was a bit of a leap of faith, right? It was we are now in an unprecedented time, and I'm grateful that we can step up and serve, and we will look out for you and we will make sure our people are taken care of during this period. And we don't yet know whether this will be upside or downside for Coursera, but we're going to go for it and stay in close touch and learn. And it could be that means you have thousands of more leads and thousands of more people to sell to or not. We don't know at this stage. But the other thing that was happening is, you might remember during that first few months, is that lots of layoffs started. And I think people at Coursera both felt sort of lucky to be, that they were being called to serve, but also grateful that they had their job. And that they had
the CEO able to stand up and assure everybody we're or
We
you're secure?
didn't make those kind of promises, but it was obvious because all of a sudden, at the same time we were making enterprise free, we were having this mad, huge rush, as I said, a 500% increase in traffic on the consumer side of the business. So the company's revenues were skyrocketing and the registrations were skyrocketing. So it was clear to everyone that the company was now super, super stable when most companies were panicking and figuring out how do they, support their bottom line. So it was a confluence of factors, and we ended up exceeding our revenue goals by far in the enterprise space. And I had told you the story of making the campus response free. We then had a follow-on response for governments. We called it the Workforce Response Initiative, when we allowed any government that wanted to support unemployed people or displaced workers, they could have Coursera for free. And we did the same thing with companies. We launched something called the Employee Resilience Initiative, where we packaged all of our wellness and diversity courses and psychology courses and made them available to companies. And, there was one team that we had to support financially, but in the end, it ended up being major upside and transformed the trajectory of the company for sure. And more importantly, transformed the education space, which we can talk more about or not.
Yeah, no, I'd love to go right in a second, but let me make sure I've got right the way in which it paid off, so to speak. So, so giving the software away for free to those constituencies, but end up building the enterprise business. How? Who became the paying customers ultimately?
So we defined a freemium version and an enterprise version. So the free version had no customer support. It had, a limited time. So I think we had it going through October. And it had unlimited access to catalog, but just for that defined period. And so during that time, we also had institutions who tried out the product. We achieved something like 70% penetration of the universities in Egypt. So these institutions from all over the world, from Nigeria and Egypt and Cote d'Ivoire and Korea, all over, who then said, you know what, we want to double down, because they were now in a crisis. So many of the institutions that we were serving are not institutions that had significant digital penetration. So unlike, the top US universities, they didn't have backup plans with LMS systems that they could switch to. And so it really, it accelerated the market and opened people's eyes to the power of online education. And we became like a known solution in the market.
And as you were referencing, one of Coursera's goals is to transform education in the process. And so I'm curious, in this period, you've got a lot of traditional universities jumping online, and I'm assuming first order of business is like, let's just recreate as close as possible the in-person classroom experience, but remotely, and get that up and running, which, as far as I can tell, runs counter to at least aspects of how Coursera is trying to innovate in online education, dispense with some of the trappings of traditional education. I'm not imagining that was a discussion you could have with these universities on day one. But how do you avoid a situation where, like, I don't know, basically you're reinventing something you set out to or you're recreating something you set out to disrupt in the first place?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I would clarify two things. Our goal is not to disrupt education. Our goal is to transform lives through learning, and whatever needs to change in the sector to make education higher quality, more accessible, more skills relevant. That's what we want to do. We want to serve learners. But what's interesting about the way Coursera is positioned is we're just a technology platform, but the content is from top universities in the world. So we are allowing them to extend their reach, and in doing so, innovate and expand how education is delivered. So in the business that I lead in, Coursera for Campus, the way the sector traditionally works is every institution would need to have its own psychology 101 teacher and its own Python programming teacher and its own, name your class. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily, an institutional collaboration wasn't a big global thing. Now you're also in a situation where like 40% of students graduate, 40% of universities actually aren't able to teach the skills needed for students to get job. And there's a big shortage both of accessible learning, but also of faculty to teach those courses. So the biggest change that happened is it opened the floodgates in a moment of desperation to create inter-university collaboration, where a university in China might be taking courses from Duke and a university in India might be using courses from Michigan or from Google or IBM. And sometimes it would be a faculty incorporating them in their courses. And sometimes, there wasn't a faculty member and all of a sudden the students at the school had access to these new courses. So, is it disruption? I think it's more, it's like a beautiful story of innovation from within a sector with a central tech platform that's facilitating that change.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and not an aspect of how university education changed over the pandemic that I was really aware of. But makes a lot of sense. So to be clear, you're getting the degree from your home university, but able to enroll in courses not just at the university down the street, but in some cases anywhere. Got it. That well, I. Maybe we turn to constituency of companies that you're selling to. So in that case, what's the value proposition when your team is out talking to companies that to buy a Coursera license for their employees?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we primarily do is we reskill and upskill employees. We allow companies to reskill and upskill their employees by providing a skills development platform. And so it includes both the high quality content, includes career pathways and skills pathways in what we call academies in data science and marketing and finance. And then we allow companies to actually assess the skills of their folks, benchmark it against other companies, and then assess how skills are progressing as their employees learn. What's striking is that lots of companies provide learning as part of corporate training. But what changed during the pandemic is that digital transformation accelerated. So many companies needed to become much, much more reliant on technology. And a lot of the frontline workers that they laid off, they realized they might not have the same jobs to come home to. So companies have become very, very focused on making sure that they have skilled digital talent. And so the learning programs they need to deploy need to drive towards their goals. They need to make sure that their employees are actually acquiring the skills that they need. So that's the focus of the business. During the pandemic, I would say these are the key trends that accelerated. But there was also, a big thing that's happened in the corporate space is, companies, the way they understand their fiduciary responsibility and their need to support employee well-being has changed. And I think for many companies who reached out to us during the pandemic, they realized that it was a way of supporting their employees' health and giving them purpose and making them feel connected in a remote world. And so, there's a range of different goals that we've served, but the core focus is to enable upskilling and reskilling.
Got it. That makes sense. Speaking of a lot of companies, Quartz included, rethinking their purpose or existing during the pandemic. I know Coursera earlier this year became a certified B Corporation. For those listening, B Corps put a mission at the heart of the company and legally in the corporate charter, and can be held accountable for upholding that mission as well as the fiscal health of the company. And then the certification is the third party audit. Is this company actually doing what it says and upholding its obligations to society, which is, you're not the only publicly traded company to be a B Corp, but I can count them on one hand, I think, at this point. So it's definitely new. And I'd love to hear how that is changing, or has changed how Coursera operates as a company. Is it present in your executive meetings and another part of the day-to-day work, or is that am I misinterpreting it?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I can tell you personally, becoming a B Corp was incredibly meaningful for me. I'm someone who was involved in the corporate reform movement way back in college. You might remember there were protests of the WTO, and it was during that period that the B Corp was first invented. And And so many people are skeptical. The notion that you'd have a company that wasn't just obligated to profits and didn't just owe their shareholders profits was heretical. So then, a decade later, to be able to have a company and enable it to be a B Corp was transformative. The honest truth is not much has changed, because most companies who become B Corps, I think one of the most famous companies is Patagonia. Their core mission, the core of what they do is make awesome outdoor clothing. But as a B Corp, they've also added other key goals to their mission connected to sustainability and employee welfare. But for Coursera, our core business goal is to transform lives through learning and enable reach and access to education. So we're not like many of the other B Corps who had to add on extra goals to our core business model and mission. Our core business model enables us to serve the same goals that we articulated in our B Corp. But it was meaningful because, the universities who are our partners, they are mission-oriented institutions, and our employees are mission-oriented. And, we did this right before we went public. And so to be able to say to all of our partners and then all of our employees, we are going public, but we want to emphasize that at the core of what we care about is access to learning. And so, it was a fantastic ride to be able to become a B Corp, announce that, and then go public and have Wall Street embrace the company in the way it has. Has been awesome.
It's inspiring to me, and I love thinking back to the decision you had to make at the beginning of the pandemic, how ultimately, I'm sure it was a harder decision and it was more complicated, but it ultimately came down to coming back to that mission. Like if your mission is to spread online learning as widely as possible, and this crisis/opportunity presents itself, the answer is, again, as in retrospect, it's pretty obvious what to do, even despite the business risk. And you hear so much of mission-driven companies these days, and I worry it's sort of getting to be clear, we use that term very specifically. We write Quartz is for mission-driven professionals, but it's such a widely used term where it gets it lacks meaning. And what I'm hearing from you is there's a difference between wanting to do good in the world as a part of your operations, or making sure to take into account your stakeholders, even as you're going about day-to-day business. And that's one type of corporate social responsibility, and it's super important, no doubt. But there is a whole other class of companies, and that is part of the B Corp movement, that where you're trying to make it one and the same. And it's moments like that where you got a bet the company type decision to make that where that can be, that's quite helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be in what's unique is you have a company where the success of the core business model also means success in terms of impacting lives. And I don't know that there's that many companies in the world. And if there were, we should discover them all. You should inspire all your viewers to find them. But that's the goal, to be able to find that type of alignment, but it's hard.
Well, we've very intentionally invited guests this season from other B Corps as well to get that perspective. And I'm really glad we started with yours and the story of Coursera. Leah, this is super helpful and inspiring to me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. And I look forward to hearing the other episodes and hearing the stories of those other B Corp leaders as well.
Sure thing. Well, good luck getting back to normal, whatever that looks like or feels like, and whenever it occurs, for yourself, for your sake, and your teams.
Take care.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Make Business Better. Thanks again to Leah for joining us, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. You can follow Quartz on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, wherever you're getting us right now, and you'll always be notified whenever we go live. Our next episode will be in 2 weeks, again on Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.